April 14th, 1951. Inside a Spanish Gothic castle perched on a hilltop overlooking the California coast, the most powerful newspaper magnate in American history is dying. William Randolph Hearst, the man who owned 28 newspapers, who manufactured wars with headlines, who made presidents and destroyed them with equal ease, who built a media empire so vast that 1 in 4 Americans read his papers every single day, is broke. The castle around him contains 165 rooms filled with European art worth hundreds of millions, but he doesn't own most of it anymore. Forced to sell piece by piece, statue by statue, tapestry by tapestry, just to pay his debts. The woman beside him, Marion Davies, blonde, beautiful, the showgirl turned actress he loved for 33 years, the woman he built this castle for, the woman who stayed with him through scandal and bankruptcy, is crying because she knows what's coming. When he dies, his legal wife, Millicent, who he hasn't lived with in decades, will inherit everything. And Marion, despite 3 decades of devotion, despite nursing him through this final illness, despite paying his medical bills from her own savings when his money ran out, will get nothing. Not the castle, not the art, not even acknowledgment that she existed. But here's what makes this story different from every other tale of wealth and fall down, what makes it cut deeper than simple financial ruin. Hearst didn't lose his fortune through bad luck or market crashes or circumstances beyond his control. He spent it deliberately, obsessively. For 28 years, he poured everything he had into building this castle, and it was never finished, never completed. He died with entire wings still under construction, rooms without furniture, plans for more buildings that would never be built. He spent somewhere between $50 and $70 million, nobody knows exactly because he stopped letting accountants track it, building a monument to himself that was supposed to fill a void, supposed to prove something, supposed to make him feel like he'd arrived, like he'd built something permanent, and the void never filled. The castle just got bigger and emptier and more expensive, and the man who built it ended up dying broke in a borrowed house in Beverly Hills because he couldn't afford to stay in his own palace anymore. This is the story of Hearst Castle, but it's not about architecture or art collections or California tourism. It's about what happens when you try to build your way to happiness, when you think that if you just make it magnificent enough, expensive enough, filled with enough treasures from enough centuries, it will somehow compensate for what's missing inside you. It's about a man who controlled the narrative of American history through his newspapers, but couldn't control his own story, who manufactured the Spanish-American War, but couldn't manufacture love from a wife who despised him, who destroyed Orson Welles for making Citizen Kane, but couldn't destroy the truth at the heart of that film, that all the castles in the world can't fill the emptiness where genuine connection should be. By the time we're done, you'll understand why the most powerful man in America died essentially homeless, why the castle that was supposed to immortalize him instead became proof that wealth and power and beauty can coexist with profound failure, and why Marion Davies, dismissed by history as just a mistress, just a showgirl, might have been the only person who truly understood what Hearst was running from, and why no amount of construction could ever help him catch what he was chasing. William Randolph Hearst was born in 1863 in San Francisco to a father who'd made a fortune in mining during the gold rush and a mother who was obsessed with culture, with refinement, with proving that Western wealth could match Eastern sophistication. His father, George, was a rough, practical man who believed in making money and spending it on tangible assets. His mother, Phoebe, was the opposite: art, music, European travel, everything that signaled education and taste. And young William grew up between these two extremes, inheriting his father's aggressive business instincts and his mother's compulsive need to acquire beautiful things and surround herself with symbols of cultivation. It was a dangerous combination, though nobody recognized it at the time. At Harvard, Hearst was expelled for practical jokes and general hell-raising, but he'd already discovered his real interest: newspapers.
His father owned the San Francisco Examiner, a failing paper he'd acquired to pay off a gambling debt. And in 1887, 23-year-old William convinced his father to let him run it. What Hearst did next changed American journalism forever, though not in ways anyone should celebrate. He invented what became known as yellow journalism, sensationalism, manufactured outrage, stories that prioritized drama over truth, headlines designed to provoke emotional response rather than inform. The strategy worked spectacularly. The Examiner's circulation exploded, and Hearst learned a lesson that would shape the rest of his life. You can manufacture reality. You can create narratives that people believe, that shape their understanding of the world, that move them to action. In 1898, Hearst literally started a war. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, probably from an accidental internal fire, Hearst's papers immediately blamed Spain, ran inflammatory headlines about Spanish treachery, published stories, many completely fabricated, about Spanish atrocities in Cuba. "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war," he allegedly told an artist he'd sent to Cuba, who reported that there was no war to illustrate. Whether he actually said it or not, he did it. The Spanish-American War was Hearst's creation, his newspapers pushing opinion and political pressure until President McKinley had no choice but to declare war. Hearst learned he didn't just report history, he could make it. By 1900, Hearst owned newspapers in New York, Chicago, Boston, and Los Angeles. By 1920, he controlled 28 newspapers, the largest media empire America had ever seen. He also owned magazines, Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, Harper's Bazaar, and newsreel companies and wire services. 1 in 4 Americans got their news from a Hearst publication. He was arguably the most powerful private citizen in the country, able to make or break political careers, to shape public opinion on any issue, to decide what Americans thought about and what they ignored. And he was profoundly, almost pathologically unhappy. In 1903, Hearst married Millicent Wilson, a chorus girl, in a marriage that seems to have been based on social convention rather than passion. She gave him 5 sons. She managed his households and appeared beside him at public events, and he was bored, distant, increasingly focused on his newspapers and his increasing interest in politics. He served in Congress, ran unsuccessfully for mayor of New York and governor of New York, harbored presidential ambitions that never materialized. The marriage was functional, but cold, and by 1915, both of them understood it was essentially over, though divorce was out of the question. Hearst was Catholic, and divorce would destroy his political ambitions, so they stayed married on paper while living increasingly separate lives.
And then in 1917, Hearst met Marion Davies. She was 19 years old, a chorus girl and model, blonde and funny and irreverent in ways that upper-class women of Hearst's social circle never were. He was 54, married with 5 children, one of the most famous men in America. The affair should have been a scandal. Instead, Hearst made it semi-respectable through sheer force of will and unlimited money. He set Marion up in films, founding Cosmopolitan Pictures specifically to make her a star, spending millions on her movies, insisting his newspapers give them rave reviews regardless of their actual quality. He bought her jewelry, bought her houses, bought her everything except the one thing she apparently wanted most, marriage. And she stayed. For 33 years, Marion Davies stayed with William Randolph Hearst, accepting the role of mistress, accepting that she'd always be secondary to Millicent legally, even though emotionally Millicent had long since ceased to matter. In 1919, Hearst began building the castle. He'd inherited 250,000 acres of California ranch land from his mother, property that ran along the coast between Los Angeles and San Francisco, remote and beautiful and utterly private. On a hilltop overlooking the Pacific, he decided to build what he called the ranch, what everyone else would call Hearst Castle or San Simeon. He hired Julia Morgan, one of the first female architects in America, and gave her instructions that seemed simple but were actually impossible. Build me something magnificent.
something that combines Spanish and Mediterranean and Gothic and Renaissance styles, something filled with art and antiquities from Europe, something that will be the most beautiful private residence in America. And keep building, never finish, always expand, always add more. For 28 years, construction continued. Workers were employed permanently, year-round, constantly building new wings, new guest houses, new pools, new gardens. Hearst traveled Europe buying entire rooms from castles and monasteries and villas, having them disassembled, shipped to California, and reconstructed inside his castle. He bought Roman mosaics and medieval tapestries and Renaissance paintings and Egyptian statues and Greek columns. He bought choir stalls from Spanish churches and ceilings from Italian palaces and fireplaces from French chateaux. The castle became a kind of three-dimensional catalog of European art history, everything jumbled together without much concern for chronological or stylistic consistency, united only by the fact that Hearst thought it was beautiful and wanted to own it. The Neptune Pool alone, an outdoor swimming pool decorated with marble colonnades and ancient Roman temple facades, cost over $1 million and was rebuilt 3 times because Hearst kept changing his mind about the design. The indoor Roman pool was lined with Venetian glass tiles in deep blue and gold, creating an effect that was genuinely stunning, one of the most beautiful interior spaces in America. The main building, Casa Grande, rose 115 feet, its towers visible for miles, dominating the hilltop like a cathedral. There were 165 rooms total, including 16 bedrooms, 61 bathrooms, 19 sitting rooms, a movie theater, a library with thousands of rare books, and dining halls that could seat dozens of guests. And Hearst filled it with guests. Every weekend, Hollywood stars and political figures and business leaders would be invited to the castle. The guest list over the years included Charlie Chaplin, Clark Gable, Greta Garbo, Winston Churchill, Calvin Coolidge, Charles Lindbergh, anyone important, anyone famous, anyone Hearst wanted to impress or influence or simply be entertained by. The weekends followed a pattern. Guests would arrive Friday, be assigned rooms in one of the guest houses, attend elaborate dinners where Hearst sat at the center of a long table with Marion beside him, watch movies in the private theater, swim in the pools, play tennis, ride horses, and most importantly, admire the castle and tell Hearst how magnificent it was. He needed that admiration, needed constant validation that he'd built something remarkable, something that proved his importance, his taste, his success. But the validation never stuck. No amount of praise satisfied him for long, so he kept building, kept buying, kept expanding. By the 1920s, he was spending over $1 million a year just on construction at San Simeon, plus millions more buying art and antiquities. His newspaper empire was generating enormous profits, but he was spending faster than the money came in. His accountants begged him to slow down, to at least track his expenditures so they could budget. He refused. "I don't want to know what things cost. If I knew, I might not buy them, and I want to buy them," he told one of them. The Great Depression should have been a warning. Newspaper revenues plummeted as advertising dried up, and readers canceled subscriptions they could no longer afford. Hearst's empire, which had been generating tens of millions in profit annually, suddenly was barely breaking even. But construction at San Simeon continued. Hearst couldn't stop. The castle had become more than a house. It was the physical manifestation of his ego, his importance, his defense against the possibility that he was, underneath all the power and wealth, just an unhappy man who'd never figured out how to connect with people in ways that mattered. In 1937, the financial crisis became acute. Hearst owed tens of millions to creditors. Several of his newspapers were losing money. His real estate holdings were mortgaged beyond their value. The art collection at San Simeon was worth perhaps $100 million, but much of it was pledged as collateral for loans. A consortium of banks essentially took control of Hearst's empire, forced him to sell assets, shut down unprofitable newspapers, liquidate parts of the art collection. Construction at San Simeon stopped. Workers were dismissed. The castle, after 18 years of continuous expansion, suddenly froze in place, unfinished, some wings barely started, some rooms still without furniture or decoration. And Hearst was devastated. The castle was supposed to be proof that he'd won, that he'd built something permanent, that his power and wealth translated into something meaningful. Instead, it became evidence of failure, of excess, of an ego that had consumed his fortune. He kept the castle. The banks couldn't force him to sell his residence, but he could barely afford to maintain it. The zoo he'd built, which had contained the largest private animal collection in the world, lions, elephants, zebras, exotic birds, had to be liquidated, the animals sold to other zoos or killed when no buyers could be found. Staff was reduced to a skeleton crew. Entire wings of the castle were closed off, sheets thrown over furniture, art crated up for storage or sale. And then in 1941, Orson Welles released Citizen Kane. The film was transparently based on Hearst, the newspaper magnate who builds a massive estate called Xanadu, who collects art compulsively, who manipulates public opinion through his papers, who has an affair with a talentless young woman he tries to make into an opera star, who ends up alone in his palace, surrounded by treasures that mean nothing, dying with the word rosebud on his lips, the simple sled from his childhood, the last time he was genuinely happy, before wealth and power complicated everything.
The parallels to Hearst were so obvious that Welles didn't even bother denying them. Hearst tried to destroy the film. He offered RKO Pictures the full cost of production, over $800,000, to burn the negative and all prints. When that failed, he banned any mention of the film in his newspapers, pressured theaters not to show it, used every bit of influence he had to limit its distribution. He partially succeeded. Citizen Kane's initial release was limited, and it lost money at the box office, but he couldn't kill it completely. And over time, as the film was recognized as a masterpiece, as critics called it the greatest film ever made, Hearst's attempts to suppress it only made him look petty and guilty, as if the portrait Welles had painted was accurate and Hearst knew it. The 1940s were a slow decline. Hearst's empire was intact but diminished, his influence waning as radio and then television changed how Americans got their news. He lived mostly in Los Angeles, at Marion's Beverly Hills house, visiting San Simeon occasionally but unable to afford the costs of maintaining it at the level he'd once demanded. Marion took care of him, managed his household, paid bills from her own money when his ran short. And the relationship, which had begun as an affair based on power imbalance and financial dependence, became something more genuine as Hearst's power faded and his dependence on Marion increased. She stayed not because he was buying her things or making her famous, but because after 30 decades, she loved him in ways that perhaps neither of them had expected. In early 1951, Hearst's health collapsed. Heart problems, circulatory issues, the accumulated damage of 88 years, including the last decade of enormous stress. Doctors moved him to Marion's Beverly Hills house because San Simeon was too remote for the level of medical care he needed. Marion hired nurses, converted rooms into a makeshift hospital wing, devoted herself to keeping him comfortable. And Hearst's sons, none of whom had ever accepted Marion, none of whom had forgiven their father for the affair that had humiliated their mother, began circling. They knew their father was dying. They knew that legally Millicent would inherit control of the estate, and they wanted Marion gone. Hearst died on August 14, 1951, at Marion's house. She was holding his hand. Within hours, some accounts say within 90 minutes, Hearst's sons arrived with lawyers and forced Marion to leave. Their father's body was still in the house, but they ordered her out, said she had no legal right to be there, that this was family business, and she wasn't family. She left. After 33 years, after staying through scandal and bankruptcy, after paying his bills and nursing him through his final illness, Marion Davies was ejected from the house where her lover had just died, forbidden from attending the funeral, erased from the official story of Hearst's life as if she'd never existed. The will was read. Millicent inherited control of the Hearst Corporation and received the majority of the estate. The 5 sons received trust funds and positions in the company. Marion received nothing. Hearst had apparently intended to provide for her, but his financial crisis in the 1930s had complicated everything, and his sons had successfully pressured him to remove provisions for Marion from his final will. She was financially independent by this point. She'd made smart real estate investments with her own money and wasn't destitute. But the symbolic erasure was devastating. The man she'd loved for 30 decades, who she believed loved her, had left her nothing. Not money, not jewelry, not even a personal letter acknowledging their relationship. San Simeon, Hearst Castle, passed to the Hearst Corporation, which couldn't afford to maintain it as a private residence. In 1957, the Hearst family donated it to the state of California, which turned it into a museum and tourist attraction. Today, 750,000 people visit every year, walking through the rooms Hearst filled with art, swimming in the pools he built, looking at the castle he never finished. Tour guides tell the architectural history, point out the Roman mosaics and Renaissance paintings, explain how rooms were imported from Europe. But what they mostly don't talk about is the human story beneath the magnificence, that this castle was built by a man trying to fill a void that couldn't be filled, that every room and every artwork and every expensive renovation was another attempt to make himself feel like he'd achieved something meaningful, that he died broke, having spent his entire fortune building a monument that proved only that beauty and wealth can coexist with profound emptiness. San Simeon, Hearst Castle, stands today exactly as it was in 1947 when construction permanently stopped. Unfinished, some wings incomplete, some plans never realized. The state has maintained it perfectly, preserved it like a museum exhibit, but they haven't completed Hearst's vision because nobody knows what his vision was. He never had a final plan, never said this is finished, never stopped imagining new wings and new rooms and new collections. The incompleteness is the point. The castle was never supposed to be finished, because finishing would mean confronting the question Hearst spent his entire life avoiding. Now that you've built this, now that you own all this beauty, now that you've proven you can create something magnificent, has it made you happy? Does it fill the void? Was it worth it?
And the answer, which Hearst knew but couldn't acknowledge, was no. The castle didn't make him happy. It consumed his fortune, ruined his company, distracted him from the work that had actually made him powerful, and ultimately left him dying in someone else's house because he couldn't afford to live in his own creation. The woman he loved for 33 years got nothing when he died. His legal wife, who he hadn't lived with in decades, inherited everything and probably felt no satisfaction in the victory. His sons divided an empire diminished from what it had been, and the castle became a museum, a tourist attraction, a place where strangers walk through and take photographs and marvel at the excess while having no idea of the desperation that drove it. This is what Hearst Castle really is. Not a testament to success, but a monument to the limits of what money can accomplish. Hearst had everything: wealth, power, influence, access to beauty and art and luxury that most people can't imagine. He could buy anything, build anything, create anything he could envision. And he used all that power and wealth to build a palace, and the palace couldn't do the one thing he needed it to do, which was make him feel like his life had meaning, like he'd built something that mattered, like he was more than just a man who'd accumulated possessions and called it achievement. The most powerful man in America died broke and essentially homeless, having spent everything building something that proved only that you can't purchase fulfillment, can't construct meaning, can't fill internal emptiness with external beauty, no matter how magnificent. And maybe that's the real lesson of Hearst Castle. Not about journalism or wealth or even ambition, but about the fundamental impossibility of building your way to happiness. Of thinking that if you just make it grand enough, expensive enough, filled with enough treasures from enough centuries, it will somehow compensate for what's actually missing, which is connection, purpose, the ability to be satisfied with what you have rather than constantly needing more. Hearst spent 88 years and somewhere between $50 and $70 million learning that lesson. And he died without ever really learning it, still believing somewhere deep down that if he'd just been able to finish the castle, if he'd just been able to afford a few more rooms, a few more artworks, a few more wings, then maybe it would have been enough. Maybe then he would have felt like he'd arrived, like he'd built something permanent, like his life had been worthwhile. But there was never going to be enough rooms, never going to be enough art, never going to be enough castle. The void he was trying to fill wasn't architectural. And all the marble and mosaics and Mediterranean magnificence in the world couldn't change that simple, terrible truth. If this story made you think differently about wealth, power, and what we build to justify our existence, subscribe for more. And tell me in the comments, have you visited Hearst Castle? Does knowing the story change how you see it?